Indiana Jones is a man who doesn't forget. It's been 16 years since Professor Basil Smith saved his life, and now, when he receives a telegram from the archaeologist in Istanbul, Indy finally has a chance to return the favor. But when he arrives in Turkey, his friend has suddenly disappeared. All traces point to Egypt. There, in the shadow of the pyramids, Indiana Jones encounters an ancient, cruel force that has been waiting for its liberation for millennia. And one thing only too soon becomes clear to him. In the desert, everyone ends up the same, as a bleached skeleton under a shroud of sand. In Indiana Jones and the Labyrinth of Horus.
Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I'll be discussing the 7th of the 8 German novels written by Wolfgang Holbein featuring Indiana Jones. These were all officially licensed by Lucasfilm, but have never been republished and have never been translated until now, with the beautiful fan translations freely available that have all been put together as a labor of love. So Book 7 is translated under the title Indiana Jones and the Labyrinth of Horus. This book was originally written and published in 1993 and is set in the year of 1941 in terms of the Indiana Jones chronology. Now, as I've discussed with the previous novels I've reviewed in the series, Holbein always has a nice handle on Indy as a character, has a great sense of humor, and a lot of action in his books. So they do frequently resemble the films. It's just that sometimes the plots can meander, and it's basically a matter of your mileage may vary, with some books going kind of off the deep end into fantasy and over-the-top moments and territory, like the second book, Labyrinth of the Gods, really doing that, and then others having some issues with plotting and characterization, but still remaining good, solid adventures. Again, I think it's very much going to be a matter of indie fans will certainly probably prefer some novels over the others simply due to the style and tone and what they like to see in an indie story. I do think it's a good thing for indie fans to read these. Not only is it a nice rite of passage, but it does give you some solid new indie adventures that we haven't had before, and you can now finally read them and not have to track down expensive German paperbacks and also be able to read German. But then you get to this book, which is, I think, the real gem of these. I think this is by far the best of the 8 German books. And this book is so enjoyable that I feel like I need to redo my ranking of the indie novels to now include the German books. Previously, I just did the Bantam and Del Rey books, so all of the U.S. Indiana Jones novels. But this book is so good, it, I think, needs to be ranked along the others, so I think I need to redo my ranking. And it's the best indie reading I've had in terms of a novel since I finished the Max McCoy books, which is why I have all the Max McCoy books behind me. This has a lot of the strengths of the McCoy indie novels, a great deal of action. It has all of the strengths of the other Holbein novels, and little to no of the pitfalls in terms of the pacing, the characterizations of other characters. It doesn't really have the same level of sort of cliches that emerge when you read all the Holbein books in order. And it's the most consistently enjoyable indie adventure. It starts with a bang. And while the opening sequence, as the Holbein openers are, is a little bit extended, it actually features Indiana Jones and feels like it's been ripped right out of a film. It's one of the best openings of any indie novel I've read. And that alone gets the reader off to a great start. And thankfully, the book never deviates from that. It has a good, solid pulp adventure plot that is established at the start, maintained throughout. There's no portions of this book that have a feeling of it starting to become a slog, especially in the second act, which is typically an issue I've noted with the previous 6 books. I think the characterization of all of our side characters, the allies, the villains, I think everything is worked out nicely. And the plot that emerges and what the potential danger could be is properly established and feels fulfilling enough. I wouldn't call this a perfect book, but it's so ridiculously enjoyable that it's, I think, among the best of all the Indiana Jones novels. So, to briefly talk about the plot, as the blurb indicates, Indy gets a message from an old colleague of his, Professor Basil Smith, who once saved Indiana Jones' life. It's not exactly said how, but it is strongly conveyed that Indy feels he owes him a sort of debt of honor, and he receives this mysterious telegram asking for Indy to travel to Istanbul to assist the professor, who he hasn't seen in many years, and has made various claims that in the archaeologist community has made him sort of persona non grata, and now he's sort of fallen on hard times as he's exhausted his own personal fortune. This is only told after the extended opening sequence, which finds Indy in a truck trying to get away from an entire tribe after him, tearing through the city streets as he's trying to hopefully get to the dock so he can get on the outgoing ship he has tickets to, and of course where his sort of arch rival, frenemy nemesis, the dean of his college, Griswold, is waiting for him. They've apparently gone on an expedition, and Indy's gone off and now has an entire army after him, essentially. After an extended, fantastically realized action sequence that has multiple stages of essentially an inversion of the Raiders' truck chase, because it's Indy in the truck with the artifact, everyone chasing after him, the truck getting destroyed bit by bit, the town getting destroyed bit by bit, Indy trying not to kill anyone and trying to not be murdered, trying to survive as the truck crashes multiple times, and then he has difficulty getting onto the actual ship, which actually has left the dock, and then they still keep chasing him. And after all of this, he winds up having to deal with the fussy Griswold, and then there's an even final action humorous grace note after that, and then we get to the business with the telegram and jump into what is the main plot. So the opening sequence alone is worth the price of admission, and it's one of the best action sequences not only in the Holbein series but in any Indiana Jones novel. Again, it's so well realized you can visualize the movie action scene that doesn't exist in your head. And it's so good, it almost starts to make up for how bad the city cart chase sequence was in Dial of Destiny. Basically, it's the chase you wish you had gotten in an Indy film, in terms of Indy on a runaway vehicle being chased through city streets and bazaars and back alleys and things. So it really gets the book off to a great start and makes the reader extraordinarily happy. And that spirit, thankfully, continues throughout the rest of the book. Indy decides he's going to follow up this telegram because it's appealing to his code of honor. He decides he's going to take any chance to potentially save the man who saved his life, who he feels such gratitude for. But of course, it's not that easy. We see Indy actually get to Istanbul and have difficulty actually tracking down where his friend might be, and then only to find that his friend has disappeared and his whereabouts are unknown. He meets up actually with Professor Smith's children, Elizabeth Smith and Raymond Smith, who are essentially a mismatched pair of siblings. Raymond is a character who is very book smart, very, for lack of a better term, nerdish, is of a shorter stature, and is not necessarily the most grounded character. He's a bit skittish, essentially, but tries to act in a sort of gung-ho manner, and amusingly, on their first meeting, has hired a bunch of goons to essentially test Indiana Jones's mettle. Meanwhile, the character of Elizabeth Smith immediately takes a disliking to this rugged-looking fellow who's supposed to help them find their father and be the great Dr. Jones they've always heard about. This starts their amusing banter and squabbling and yelling at each other that lasts throughout the rest of the book, and very much establishes the traditional sort of Indiana Jones heroine dynamic of her always hating Indy's guts in ways and constantly yelling at him, and they get on each other's nerves, as we see in the films with Marion and Willie. I love that dynamic, and it's really well done here, and I think even better than the dynamic we saw back in the first Holbein book of Indy having to get along with the daughter of an old friend. So that idea has returned, but I think here it's much better realized, and I think the character is much more well-rounded, and there's a lot of fun interplay between Indy and the two children of his friend that now he's having to try and find and hope that he isn't dead. Professor Smith disappeared on his quest, which is revealed over the course of their investigation to be somehow in connection with ancient Egyptian legends and potentially dealing with the ancient Egyptian deity of Horus, and thus possibly being linked to some earth-shattering discovery of potential powers, or linked to some sort of device, or something linked to the supposed powers of the ancient Egyptian gods. And with it being 1941, in the midst of World War II, it's of course always possible that the Germans could get their hands on it. So Indy winds up having to also deal with the British government officials in Istanbul and Egypt, who know of Professor Smith's dealings and also indicate that Professor Smith was also working on behalf of their interests as well. So there's essentially a sort of hang up in connection with the British government that they're not necessarily willing to divulge to either Professor Smith's surviving children or to Indiana Jones. This is the basic sort of plot setup and what we see play out through the rest of the book. And since this is such a nicely plotted adventure, I don't really want to go into more story elements than that because I don't want to spoil this story for anyone. It does follow a logical storyline, so I think for the most part the reader will be able to see where this is going and enjoy the ride of the actual narrative, which is something you need in a pulp adventure. So I think this has the best narrative foundation of any of the Holbein books, and that's another reason why I think it's the best of them. The actual war does make appearances throughout the narrative, not only with dealing with the British Army officials and worrying about the Nazis potentially getting their hands on what may be some ancient Egyptian power source, but also our characters wind up crash landing in the middle of a war zone because they have to travel to Greece to discover potential artifacts and further leads to follow the trail that leads to Egypt, and essentially are dropped smack in the middle of a war zone on the island of Crete. And this just furthers the tension felt by this story taking place during the war, which is something that's going to affect most indie stories that, of course, take place during the war years. The final act does, of course, take place in Egypt and does see the final act deal with the ancient Egyptian landscapes and a secret temple. And there's also a nefarious group of seemingly unstoppable warrior monks who appear at various times, and the book does actually have a pretty substantial body count, and the violence is actually quite well done in a sort of striking way in terms of its overall effectiveness. There's, of course, more to do with the actual backstory and history of the monks, as we discover in the final act of the book, and the overall climax does fit very much in the indie style of there being multiple parties going after the same thing for different reasons, and Indiana Jones has to essentially figure out what side he's on and how to not upset the balance or the natural order of things, and deal with his own internal struggle between fortune and glory and being an archaeologist. Now, when you do read the Holbein novels in order, I think you'll still feel that this is part of the same series. It has some similar issues, but none of them are something that I really object to or found notable. I think this is the book of these 8 that manages to best sort of clean off or sand off the rough edges, and present a completely engaging, consistent, enjoyable, fun adventure narrative. Again, I think this manages to have the snap, the flavor, and the vigor that you want from an indie story, and so it most closely resembles the 4 Max McCoy novels. Again, I got flavors of Secret of the Sphinx and Philosopher's Stone and even Dinosaur Eggs when I was reading this book. And this was an indie book I didn't want to put down. I wanted to just finish the adventure, and I was so hooked into the story that I was delighted that it never had some of the issues I found in the previous books. If I did have any criticism, it would probably be that, as I've felt with the other books, but to a much lesser degree, the final resolution in the 3rd act, I wouldn't say, though, that it's actually necessarily rushed this time around. I wish it was a little bit more developed, but considering the plot reveals and where the characters are at that time, it makes sense and is fitting. But also the ending is a little bit lower key because not everybody is present. So it's a little bit of an adjustment after this nonstop adventure up to that point. It does, in ways, very much resemble the ending of Last Crusade, and how the ending in essentially the Canyon of the Crescent Moon and getting to the Holy Grail, and then the final confrontation between our core of characters. That's what it most closely resembles. And the ending does have the requisite gory moments and moments tinging into the supernatural, but without overdoing it in a historical setting. So it is perfect for an indie story. I guess my issue is that not only is it a little bit lower key, and I wish we'd had a little bit more time with some of these characters, but there's also a character 180 at the very end, a complete character reversal that it just kind of felt a little off to me. I'm not a big fan of that when it's not fully earned or where it feels out of place. As I've said before, there's one of those in the Rob McGregor book, Unicorn's Legacy, that felt like a real pulling of the rug. This one felt a bit like that. I think it's a little bit better handled because it's one of those where you think back to all the events of the book and you realize, oh, wait, that actually does make sense. I can see that. Okay. And it gives you enough time to have that minute to process the character reveal. But it just felt like one of those where I was like, okay, I can see where you're going with this. That does at least make sense. I don't know if I necessarily like that or if this needed that, but for what it is, it works. But since that's sort of thrown in there, that sort of makes the ending have a slight off-kilter flavor for the final climactic moments, that because we don't get as much of a time to adjust to that new character dynamic. It feels a little bit weird. But again, at least you're given enough time to process and live with that, and it makes sense because you're able to reflect to all of that character's actions throughout the book, and it makes sense. So in that sense, I think it's better than the one I describe at the end of Unicorn's Legacy feeling really out of place. So again, if I had any slight criticisms of Labyrinth of Horus, it would be that the ending is a little bit low key, and also a lot of things happen in a very short amount of time. And then we have one of those complete character reversals that does feel a little bit jarring. It takes a second to get used to. But outside of that, I think this really shows a gigantic improvement in the writer's crafting of an indie adventure over the previous 6 books. And since I've already read the 8th and final book, I can say without question this is the best of the 8, and if you read any one of the German novels, it should be Labyrinth of Horus, because this is not only the best of the German books, it's one of the best indie novels there is. It plays like an Indiana Jones film. You could turn this into a film and it would work perfectly as an indie film. It has the action sequences. It has the character down pat. It has really nice allies. It has some good villains. It has good henchmen. It has a good MacGuffin and plot. It's got the locations. It's got the historical artifact and background and the ancient Egyptian setting for the ending. It's got some interesting elements of World War II creeping in and how Indy's having to interact with officials of the British Army. You've got the wonderful dynamic between Indy and the children of Professor Smith, and also learning what happened to Professor Smith, and great characters to play around with. It's just a satisfying adventure. This is what you need, or this is what you come to an indie story for. And thank goodness it doesn't have the major sort of slog moments that you get in some of the previous books in this series that really, I think, drag down some otherwise very promising and still very enjoyable books. So I think that you can definitely see the author had sort of not only grown as an indie writer, but learned from some past mistakes, and also managed to overcome some various hurdles. And I think finally here in book 7 manages to do their best indie work. And I think this really does rank among the best of the indie novels. I would say this is easily one of the 5 best Indiana Jones novels, whether it be in the English language or the German language. It's that good. It's not maybe necessarily perfect, but it is start to finish a truly enjoyable book that I would recommend to anyone. Even if you're not an indie fan, you can still enjoy this if you're looking for just a great adventure to read. To briefly talk about the cover artwork, this is done in the same style as all of the original paperbacks printed by Goldman in Germany. This has a lovely artist rendering of a classic Harrison Ford pose, here with whip up raised and the sort of wonderful, cheeky indie smile starting to creep over his face, set in the pyramids of Egypt with the desert sun, the desert sands, and then a mummy's sarcophagus on the bottom. So these are all done in a similar style. We have an indie pose in the center, a locale from the book in the background, and then a sort of particular color aesthetic that matches. They're very simple, but they actually, I think, really grow on you. This, I think, in terms of composition, color, layout, design, its connection to the actual story, and the rendering of Harrison Ford, I think this is one of the best covers. I think it's a really good cover for this book, and I really do enjoy it. I really like what they did with this, so I think it's one of the better of the German covers. The fan translation is excellent. There are no major issues with any sort of slight flubs or translation issues that you might sometimes run into. The actual translations were done by different fans using different methods, some using translation tools, some using online tools, and some being translated by actual German speakers. So there's a little variation in the types of translations, but all are wonderfully done and are all freely available, which I'll have linked to in the description below. As I've said in past videos, I think these books are important, and now that there are these wonderful fan translations, I think they should be part of the overall indie experience and certainly talked about more. But this one in particular, I think Labyrinth of Horus is the one of the German novels that should be read by all indie fans. I think, again, I'm going to redo my ranking, and this one is definitely a top 5 indie novel. It's that good, it's that enjoyable, and that well executed of a pulp adventure. This is one of the best indie adventures that's not one of the films, and it nails the tone so perfectly that with some slight alterations here and there and translating into screenplay form, it could make for some sort of indie film or animated movie or extended, television film or something. It's that well executed. And so this has been one of the most enjoyable indie reading experiences I've had. And I didn't expect that going in. I expected something similar to what I'd experienced with the previous 6 books of enjoying certain elements or enjoying the overall plot, but I figured I would run into some of the same quirks and issues, and I didn't, and I was astonished. So I think this is definitely the author getting an even better handle on writing the character again, and I think this is where they managed to come up with their best overall adventure and thus their best overall Indiana Jones book. So those are my thoughts on reading the wonderful fan translation of the 7th of the German Wolfgang Holbein Indiana Jones novels, Indiana Jones and the Labyrinth of Horus. This is a wonderful, fun adventure to read. I encourage all indie fans to check this out. I really encourage all fans to check out these German books anyway, since there are now these excellent fan translations that were all done as a labor of love, and anyone can read them for free. I strongly encourage you to do so. But if you only read one of them, it has got to be this one, Labyrinth of Horus, which is without question the best of the 8 books and the one that really goes toe-to-toe with some of the best of the Bantam novels, and is, in my mind, one of the best Indiana Jones novels there is. It is a truly well-executed indie adventure that stands on its own, but also fits nicely into the continuity and events of these German novels, so you will get something out of reading them in chronological order, and some reoccurring characters and mentions and callbacks to the past novels. So, again, I would encourage people to read all 8, but if you read just one, it's got to be this one, Labyrinth of Horus, which is just a blast from start to finish. So as always, I hope my babblings about our favorite archaeologist hero and the adventures of Indiana Jones in the printed medium has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Again, I will have links to the fan translations below, which you can freely download as they are entirely fan labors of love, and I think should be enjoyed by all fans. So definitely check these out if you wish, and I would encourage people to not only read all 8 of the German books, but to also dig into to the Bantam and Scholastic and Del Rey and other examples of the printed adventures of our favorite intrepid archaeologist hero. So as always, please do keep supporting incredible fan efforts like this. Keep digging further into the mysteries of the extended world of Indiana Jones. Keep cracking the whip, keep reading, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.